Ladies and gentlemen, it is 11:58 a.m. on Thursday, April 23rd, 2020. I am Master Thich Thong Lai. I would like to extend my warmest greetings to all the people in the country and overseas people. This morning, I received two very important questions about the situation of the Parcel and Spratly Islands, which China has sent an official note to the UN forcing Vietnam to withdraw all equipment and military bases on the Parcel and Spratly Islands, including Tu Chin Beach. There are petroleum exploitations in these areas. These questions are very important, so I need to answer them first. I invite you to please follow these emails, which I will answer according to my understanding. Dear Vulnerable Thich Thong Lai, recently the Chinese Communists brought the Pham Vinh Dong's document of selling Vietnamese exclusion economic zone signed in 1958 to the United Nations. In 1958, from the latitude 17th of the North was belonging to the Vietnamese Communists under the Geneva Agreement signed on July 20th, 1954. From the 17th latitude to the Cape of Camau were belonging to the Republic of Vietnam. The President Diem was in control of the Republic of Vietnam. In the note of selling Vietnamese exclusive economic zone signed by Communist Prime Minister Pham Vinh Dong, he sold the economic zone of the Republic of Vietnam. At the time, the Spratly and Parcel Islands did not belong to Vietnamese Communists. This document was completely illegal. At the moment, a lot of forums overseas are posting comments to find ways to guide the people in the country and tell the world to know that Vietnamese people do not accept the note of Prime Minister Pham Vinh Dong. Why didn't Vulnerable have any live stream to talk about the protection of Parcel and Spratly Islands? We want to hear your voice about the issue of Chinese Communist spokesman issuing the note to the United Nations demanding a Vietnamese Communist government withdrawing all bases on the 22 islands of Spratly and Parcel, which are also occupied by Vietnam, as well as the oil rigs on the rocky areas. According to Pham Vinh Dong selling documents, these areas will be possessed by the Chinese because they are not in the 12 nautical miles from the Vietnamese shore. Per this selling note, the Chinese exclusive economic zone starts from the 13th nautical mile. We wish you to talk on this live stream session to tell people how to protect their sovereignty of land from falling into the hands of Chinese communists. We wish you well, signed by a group of Buddhist followers whom are living in Southern California. Let me analyze this situation. We should not pay attention to the note of Pham Vinh Dong because it has no legal status. It was signed in 1958. According to the Geneva Agreement signed in Switzerland in 1954, from the 17th parallel to the south of the Cape of Camau was the Republic of Vietnam, led by the President Ngo Dinh Diem, with a democratic regime. The Parcel and Spratly Islands were part of Quang Nam Da Nang province, so the note of Pham Vang Dong is not worth anything. If we review the note of Pham Vang Dong, then we can clearly see that he illegally co-sold the islands to Chinese communists. It was not legitimate with the International Convention Maritime Law, which was signed by 180 nations from the United Nations in 1982. The Maritime Law states the territorial rights of all countries in the world is 200 nautical miles from the coast of that country, not 12 nautical miles. The Law of the Sea was signed in 1982 by 180 countries, including the Chinese Communists and the Vietnamese Communists in 1982. In that year, our Republic of Vietnam was in no longer existence. Nevertheless, Pham Vang Dong Cell Note in 1958 was not internationally recognized because Vietnamese communists had no sovereignty on the islands of Parcel and Spratly. So in terms of international law, he could not sell the islands that did not belong to his regime. First of all, it is completely illegal to sell the islands that were not within their sovereignty. Because of many countries in dispute over the laws of the sea, the United Nations had a meeting of 180 countries in 1982, including the Chinese and Vietnamese Communists. They signed a maritime law, so countries in the world have specific orders in terms of territory waters and international waters. In the old days, when we escaped from Vietnam, our pilot navigated beyond 200 nautical miles. Then we were in international waters, so the Vietnamese Communist patrols would not capture and pull the boats back to land. We went to the international waters 200 nautical miles from the shore. Therefore, Pham Vang Dong's note of selling exclusive economic zone is completely invalid because it is not approved by the United Nations. It is not recognized by the Constitution and in the vitality of the maritime law. A group of Buddhist followers in Southern California asked me if I have any ideas to protect the Vietnamese territory. It is very simple. Let's take Philippines as an example. When the Chinese Communists invaded the exclusive economic zone of Malaysia, the Malaysian army must first bring their naval fleets out to defend and have warnings to Chinese communists, such as Chinese went into a 200 nautical mile territory that was recognized by the United Nations, and China signed it in 1982, asking Chinese fleet to leave within an hour. If Chinese fleet still doesn't leave the Malaysian territory waters, then they will start firing. Of course, the Chinese naval is 10 times stronger than the Malaysian Navy. However, a 21st century powerful country cannot do whatever it likes. China already signed the maritime law in 1982 under the confirmation of 180 countries. Even though Malaysia would not win the fight with China, some of Malaysian warships will sink. The Malaysian ambassador will meet with the General Secretary of the United Nations and ask to send the official protest to China. that the Chinese Navy violated the maritime law for attacking Malaysian architects. The UN Security Council will vote and then call upon the Chinese Communists to deliver the Malaysian appeal note to demand China to withdraw and compensate for damage. Firing at China will cause casualty, but we have to shoot to defend so that we can send a diplomatic note to the United Nations. Other countries in the world will vote to ask the Chinese Communists to withdraw their attacks and pay for compensation. Many people asked how I concluded that the Vietnamese Communists were furious when the Chinese Communists sent a diplomatic note at the United Nations asking Vietnam to remove all remaining military bases on Spratly and Parcel Islands. You should remember that the Parcel and Spratly Islands are not just one or two islands, but they are a combination of dozens of islands. Vietnamese Communists are stationed on a number of islands. Chinese Communists are on some islands, and even Taiwan also occupies a number of those islands. So when a Chinese spokesman ordered the Vietnamese government to withdraw all of its military bases and construction facilities on the remaining clusters of Parcel Islands and the rocky beaches, which included Tu Chin Beach. As you remember, China gave Pham Vinh Dong a diplomatic note. It recognized Vietnamese territory waters in 12 nautical miles, rather than 200 nautical miles. If we agree with them based on this note, we would fall into the trap of the Chinese Communists. We should not talk about that note. We only should talk about the United Nations maritime law that was signed by 180 countries in 1982, including the signature of Chinese Communists. We are a peace-loving nation in the world without infringement of the sovereignty of any country. 200 nautical miles from the coast is the right to territorial jurisdiction of that country, and Vietnam also has 200 nautical miles sovereignty, not 12 miles, according to Pham Vinh Dong's foolish note. I will not discuss Pham Vinh Dong's selling note because the text has no legal status. Pham Vinh Dong sold Spratly and Parcel Islands to Chinese Communists, which belonged to the Republic of Vietnam because it is located below the 17th latitude. The Geneva Convention, signed in Switzerland on July 20th, 1954, stated clearly these islands belong to the Republic of Vietnam. Therefore, his document is just a piece of paper that is not worthy for the Vietnamese community to be of concern. Once again, I want to emphasize the maritime law signed by 180 countries in 1982. 200 nautical miles from Vietnam coast is the territory water that belongs to Vietnam. There are many people who ask me, where do I have my bases, and to say that all the rigs and oil fields being exploited at the Tu Chin Beach will be taken by China. Well, because in that diplomatic note, the Chinese Communists said that Vietnam was to remove all the illegal construction and equipment on these islands. They said that the sovereignty of Vietnam is only within 12 nautical miles, based on ex-Prime Minister Pham Vinh Dong. However, according to the maritime law established in 1982, Spratly and Parcel Islands belong to Vietnamese sovereignty. We should not rely on the selling note of territory waters because that note has no legal value. Furthermore, in 1958, China was still isolated by the free world and was not part of the WTO. At that time, Chinese Communist was not a member of the United Nations, not until 1982. The United Nations has 5 nations with the veto power. These include the United States, England, France, Russia, and the People's Republic of Chiang Kai-shek. The Chinese Communists later on overthrew Chiang Kai-shek's regime and took over the veto power. The Republic of China was Taiwanese, not Chinese Communist. Until later on, the United States wanted to do business with Chinese Communists. Eventually, President Nixon signed a trade agreement with Chinese Communists, signed by Zhou Enlai. The Republic of China embassy was in Taiwan and was ceded to Chinese Communists. In 1958, our Vietnam was divided into 2 divisions. The Republic of Vietnam governed from the 17th latitude to the Cape of Camao, while the Vietnamese Communists ruled the north. During this time, neither division had a seat in the United Nations. When the President Diem applied to join the UN, Russia and the Chinese Communists were the 2 that vetoed against the Republic of Vietnam. And every time Ho Chi Minh applied to join the United Nations seats, the United States of America, France, and England voted against the Vietnamese Communists. This is the reason the selling note in 1958 cannot be recognized by the United Nations, because the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the Republic of Vietnam did not have any seat in the United Nations. You have to pay attention to this important point. Pham Vong Dung's document is just a piece of meaningless paper. We should not be foolish to talk about it, because he only recognized that Vietnam's territorial water is in the area of 12 nautical miles from the coast, while the law of the sea took place at the United Nations recognizing as 200 nautical miles. The spokesman of Chinese Foreign Ministry is asking for dismantling all military bases, all systems of illegal investments, and drilling equipment in the South China Sea region located outside the 12 nautical miles from the shore of Vietnam. Now, if we want to keep the islands, it is very simple for the Vietnamese naval to lay out a fleet of warships to shoot at Chinese warships. Of course, the Vietnamese Communist Navy cannot stand a chance with the Chinese Communists. A number of ships will be sunk from firing at the Chinese vessel, and Navy soldiers will die. But then, the Vietnamese ambassadors can send a note requesting the Secretary General of the United Nations to give the objection in accordance with the law of the sea signed in 1982, which stated the 2 Chin Beach, Spratly and Parcel Islands are in the territory of Vietnam, which was recognized by the French after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Geneva Agreement in Paris bisected the country. The Republic of Vietnam was from the 17th latitude to the Cape of Camao. Although the Vietnamese Communists are not as strong as the Chinese, they still need to ready the warships to shoot at Chinese vessels, to have such wars and sacrifice soldiers. Vietnam must have resistance, and the Vietnamese Communists must let the people protest in front of Chinese consulates around the world and in the country. Do not imprison the protesters who demand the sea and islands. Otherwise, Vietnam will forever lose the island, sea, and land. I say that we should not base on Pham Vân Dong's note, which China has presented to the United Nations, because it is absolutely not legal. In 1958, the Vietnamese Communists and Chinese Communists were not members of the United Nations. The Chinese Communists at the time did not represent China, but Taiwan did. The Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek's regime was a veto member at the United Nations. We can see clearly that when China was given a mandate of selling the Vietnamese territory signed by the Prime Minister of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, also called as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam at that time, only recognized Vietnamese sovereignty at sea with 12 nautical miles. You can read the note. It declared that there was only 12 nautical miles. That is completely incorrect. And later, in 1982, there was a powerful country. They said their territory sea was limitless, such as England. In the past, the United Kingdom declared that the sun never set on their territory. They declared that their territorial sea was very large, and large extended down to Australia and went up to Canada. They declared their territory waters were all over the world. Then countries like Portugal, during the time of World War II, it was a powerful country. France also declared its sovereignty of 500 nautical miles. Powerful countries with strong navy claims their territory waters are large, and small countries declared their territory waters as small. Eventually, the United Nations held a meeting to establish the International Maritime Law. All countries, small or large, as long as they have a territory, a government, and are recognized internationally as an independent country, then they would have 200 nautical miles as an exclusive economic zone. Although the United States is a superpower country, it only has 200 nautical miles from the U.S. coast. Russia also has only 200 nautical miles. The same for the United Kingdom, France, China, Vietnam, and so on. No one is foolish enough to give a note recognizing that Vietnamese territory has only 12 nautical miles. Because of this, I do not emphasize heavily on Pham Vân Dong's sales note. We have to fight based on the International Maritime Law established in 1982. And for that reason, the Chinese diplomatic spokesman was wrong to ask the Communists to dismantle all military bases on the 22 islands of Partial and Spratly Islands, to remove all equipment built on the rocky beach, including Tu Chin Beach. These areas are exploited and have an oil field to bring enormous resource for Vietnam. 25 billions per year according to the statistics of oil exporting. Sadly, the 25 billions are not entirely in the hands of the Vietnamese people, but they fall into the communist leaders. This is the profit that China has given to Vietnam for over the past 30 years. This is a meaty bone for the Vietnamese Communists to gnaw on, so they are willing to be Chinese henchmen. Now that China was ordered to take back, they forced Vietnam to withdraw from all islands of Spratly and Parcels Island, along with the oil rigs in Tu Chin Beach, because these islands are outside the 12 nautical mile limit. If Vietnam does not comply, China will take it back by force. China would do that basis on a note of selling Vietnamese territory from Pham Vinh Dong. However, the selling no was not publicly announced in Vietnam. It was not internationally recognized. It was illegally created when Vietnamese Communist was not a member of the United Nations. It was wrong based on the international maritime law, which was also signed by the Chinese and Vietnamese Communists along with the United States and 180 countries. So if Vietnam wants to keep its parallel islands and to oppose the Chinese documents that were submitted to the United Nations, the only way is to bring its naval force out and fire to sink the Chinese vessels. The Chinese ship might not sink, and the Vietnamese will be sacrificed, but they will regain justice because the United Nations will use the maritime law in 1982 for China to comply. If China defeats Vietnam after Vietnam fought against this invasion, China will invade Malaysia, then Indonesia, and eventually the entire East Asia. 180 countries would not accept that. Especially superpower countries like the United States will not accept that. However, Vietnam has to shout out loud, have to speak up and let the people protest. And if the Vietnamese Communists still want to be minions to bow down and sell the territory under the contract of Pham Vinh Dong, then no one could save the Vietnamese people. Do not discuss the selling note of Pham Vinh Dong because it is completely invalid. It is not worth our time to discuss. Another problem I want to discuss in today's talk is that there are many forums discussed on Facebook of overseas Vietnamese. They analyze that after this coronavirus pandemic, China will be torn into 5 or 7 divisions and the Chinese Communists will collapse, but the Vietnamese Communist Party will not. The reason they stated this is because they rely on what they observed in Cuba. Cuba does not accept U.S. aid and is embargoed by the U.S., but Cuba still exists. These Facebookers rely on that to conclude that after the Chinese Communist collapse, the Vietnamese Communists would just change its status. And at that time, it would no longer be supported by Chinese Communists, but it would change into a dictatorial regime like Venezuela, and it will survive like Cuba. In my opinion, that will not be the case for Vietnam. The Vietnamese Communist regime is completely different from the Cuban Communist regime. The Cuban Communists survived without aid from the United States and free countries. They have some aid from the Soviet Union in China, but since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they have no more aid. They receive very little aid from Chinese Communists. Recently, the Vietnamese Communists donated 500 tons of rice. Although Vietnamese people are hungry and do not have enough rice to survive. Back to the Cuban situation. The personnel in Cuba government are all educated. Their degrees and qualifications are real and are not by bribery. Importantly, Cuba is a country that still worships God. Cuban Communist members do not discriminate against Catholics, and they still respect God. Cuba produces cane sugar, cigar, tobacco, and self-sustain its own island nation. Cuba is independent, unlike a Vietnamese Communist, is a parasite which lives on the corpse of their people. Vietnamese economic and military weapons heavily rely on the Chinese Communists. The Chinese Communists gave Vietnam their weapons to suppress and restrain the people of Vietnam. The major income of Vietnam is not from its own resource. It is entirely dependent on the capitalist economy abroad, since the embargo was lifted in 1989. If other countries in the world stop doing business with Vietnam Communists, they will collapse immediately. The Vietnamese Communists can survive because they steal the land of their people and sell it for money. The Communist is a kind of parasite that lives by sucking the blood of the Vietnamese people and with the money from Chinese Communists. Therefore, when Chinese Communists are no longer providing aid, weapons, and missiles to the Vietnamese Communists, the Vietnamese Communists would surely collapse. Furthermore, the Vietnamese Communist leaders are unqualified for their position. Their education and training diplomas are fake. Most of the construction project completed today break down the next day. Cuban Communist personnel surpasses the Vietnamese. Cuban people have better education and more patriotism. They have no diplomatic note to sell their territory and peninsulas to Chinese Communists or any foreign country. On the other hand, Vietnamese Communists sold 6 provinces next to Chinese borders. All the border gates are controlled by Chinese. If Vietnam no longer has money from overseas Vietnamese and all the invested foreign companies withdrawing from Vietnam, when China collapses, the Vietnamese Communists will surely crumble. They do not do anything besides compensation from their people to make their own possessions. It is a government where 90 million people have to feed 4 million Communist Party members. These 4 million members are parasites that live off economic zones. When there is no more resources to rob from the people to make their own properties, and no more crude oil at the Tu Chin Beach to sell, the Communists will have no money to deposit into Swiss banks and send their children to study abroad. In my opinion, Cuba does not collapse but the Vietnamese Communists will collapse without Chinese Communist support, because they are parasites without education and national management. They only live off the people because they do not have a real profession. For example, a rich man left a fortune for his children. A child with knowledge that can use the wisdom to develop into a self-sustained country, while a child who only plays and gambles, selling the inherited fortune to live off until there is nothing else to sell. The Chinese Communists kept the Vietnamese as their watchdog until now. China finally released the Chindu Treaty and Pham Vong Dung's note to take it all back. When the Vietnamese Communists do not have any food left, they would not listen and work for Chinese Communists anymore. The way I see it, North Korea did not sell its territory. North Korea received aid from Chinese Communists since Kim Jong-un's grandfather. Kim II sung to his father and his time. However, as soon as the pandemic exploded, he ordered to shoot down any Chinese who runs across the North Korean border. In addition, you can clearly see that North Korea does not have any official mandate to sell its territory. It doesn't give Chinese Communists any seas nor peninsulas. Kim Jong-un was educated and graduated at Switzerland University. He is dictatorial, brutal, and greedy, but he is also a patriot. He loves his country more than the Vietnamese Communist leaders love their country because he declared to oppose Chinese communists even though North Korea received fuel, gas, rice, and food products from China since the time of his grandfather. Do not compare the communist Vietnam to other countries and say that if China collapses, then the Vietnamese communists will not. You see clearly the fake Nguyễn Phú Trọng did not dare to show his face on his birthday because the pro-Chinese faction is weak. Nguyễn Phú Trọng is no longer worth taking advantage of. Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc has banned the export of rice, but the Ministry of Industry and Trade still export rice. Look at Vietnam. Can you tell who is leading the country of Vietnam? Vietnam is now in the 12th warlords era again. The Chinese communist henchmen will no longer serve the Chinese when the $25 billion of selling crude oil is not available. They won't listen to the Chinese communists. The dog only listens to its owner when the owner is still feeding the dog. It is difficult to work with the empty stomach. These henchmen will betray because the money from selling the oil is gone. There is another Vietnamese Communist Party faction that still loves the country. These are people who do not want to sell their territory. They are gunmen ready to emerge and eliminate communism. When the Chinese communists collapse, at that time, the Vietnamese communists will run away for their lives. The 90 million compatriots are hatred for communism. They are the one who will hunt them down like stray dogs. I want to make it clear, no country is needed to arrest the leaders of the Vietnamese communists, the local police, the vice president, and the chairman of the province, the tax collectors, and the land confiscators. 95 million compatriots full of weapons, they will hunt the Vietnamese communist member down and kill them. They cannot survive because they have governed the country with the muzzles of guns. These guns are provided by the Chinese communists. Now the Chinese communist is about to collapse. The army of the United Nations coalition will join together to tear apart Chinese communists to compensate for the damage from the coronavirus, up to tens of thousands of billions of dollars. At that time, the Chinese communists has nothing to live on, only when the national budget dries up completely. No crude oil to sell, no foreign countries to invest in. The overseas Vietnamese will not return after this pandemic. Then, Vietnamese people who have been robbed of homes, lands, liberated for decades will stand up and kill the communists. These people who have a knife will use a knife. People who have a hammer will use a hammer. Use a stick to kill 4 million Communist Party members. No other country will come to destroy these Vietnamese communist parasites. In my opinion, at that time, the world will not be able to intervene on time. Even the United Nations say to wait for court trials. 2 out of 4 million party members already got killed. Do not think that the Vietnamese communists will survive when the Chinese communists collapse. It will not survive without any army to kill them. Many people ask me which army would eliminate the communists. In my view, the hatred of the people would. When the communists lose their gun muzzles, rockets, submarines, Chinese warship, then 95 million compatriots will hunt and destroy the communists themselves. Vietnam is completely different from Cuba and North Korea. Cuba and North Korea do not sell their territories, while the Vietnamese communists are traitors. They are parasites that live off the bones of Vietnamese mothers and cling on Vietnamese people. They are tapeworms living in the stomach of Vietnamese people. When the Chinese Communist Party no longer exists, these parasites would die on their own. Respectfully yours, and never say that when the Chinese Communists collapse, the Vietnamese Communists will transform. They cannot transform because the people of Vietnam will identify them and destroy them. That is my belief. And never say anything about Pham Vong Dung's note, because in that note, China only recognizes 12 nautical miles in Vietnamese exclusive economic zone signed by the ex-prime minister of the Vietnamese Communists. They need to talk basis on the maritime law of the sea in 1982. The way not to lose the country is that the Vietnamese Communists have to turn around and send warships to shoot Chinese ships currently in Vietnamese territory. Even though they would sacrifice a few ships and several dozens of Navy soldiers, only then we can have the United Nations summon the Chinese Communists to recognize the 1982 maritime law. The only way to protect the country is to fight back, even without winning, and then knock on the door of the United Nations. Also, let the 90 million people go down the street to demonstrate and express an aspiration of the Vietnamese people who are not accepting the sale of territory signed by Pham Vong Dung and the Vietnamese Communists. Respectfully yours.